Hey folks, I'm back with another video about the Milton Glaser lecture, What I Have Learned. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there is a link in the description to the video to the first installment of this mini-series. This is a lecture that the graphic artist Milton Glaser gave back in 2002, which breaks down into about 10 bullet points, and I've been making videos about most of the bullet points, not all of them, but the ones that really struck me and that seem to have relevance to my work as a science fiction and fantasy author. And today I want to talk about bullet point number 5, which is less is not necessarily more. And Glaser came to the conclusion one day that the idea that less is more was kind of a nonsensical insight. He said, if you look at a Persian rug, you cannot say that less is more, because you realize that every part of that rug, every change of color, every shift in form is absolutely essential for its aesthetic success. You cannot prove to me that a solid blue rug is in any way superior. I have an alternative to the proposition that I believe is more appropriate. Just enough is more. I thought about this one a lot after I read it, in big part because when I read this lecture for the first time, I was in the middle of working on what to date was my single biggest work, which came in at roughly around 300,000 words. It could easily have been split into 3 books. And I chose to keep it as one big volume because I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I had fun with it. You know, it was 2.5 years of my life, and it was tremendous fun, and I have no intention of ever doing it again. Because I said to myself, well, you know, that's 2.5 years that I spent on this thing, and that's a certain amount of time that I won't have to spend on other things. I did enjoy it, though. It was worth it, but I had to start seriously thinking about what it was that I was going to be doing with my time, and whether or not I necessarily wanted to have more of anything as a credo. But the opposite also seemed to hold true for me, that it didn't seem to make sense that I could take an idea and that I could whittle it down to something that would fit on a single piece of paper. So what ultimately happened was I had a kind of a thrashing back and forth where I wrote this 300,000 word thing, and then I wrote things that were much shorter than that, and I wrote things that were a little longer. And I finally got myself to the equilibrium that I think makes sense, where I said to myself, okay, now I think I know why things tend to be targeted at around the 90 or 100,000 or 110,000 word for a novel, because after a certain point things start to get unsustainable, and below a certain point or before a certain point things just don't have enough meat on the bones. And I really loved the idea of writing these big, beautiful, expansive things you could get lost in. And I really love the idea of these perfect little diamonds of things, these perfect little gems of stories that were about this one idea. But between the two of them, I realized there was a much happier medium to be found. And I realized that this happy medium was incarnate in a kind of a worldview that I had, where I've discovered that a lot of my stories tend to be roughly about the same things. They're about a world situation, like an invented world, or maybe some smaller part of our existing world that is in a tipping point moment. Things are about to change catastrophically, and the story is basically about the people who are at the interstice between the end of one way of life and the beginning of another, and a certain number of people have been tasked with jumping over that gap and getting to the other side, and this is their story. And I loved the fact that I could make a story about that exact focal moment. And I realized then it can't be too short, it can't be too long. It needs to be just enough. And that 90 to 100 to 110,000 word length seemed to be about right. I've broken this rule. There's other stuff that I've done that's been in the 140 range, and I haven't been happy about that. And so I've said to myself, yeah, I think it makes sense to aim at the 100 to the 110 range, because that's where it seems to be the biggest payoff in terms of getting the audience's attention and keeping the audience's attention and not squandering their time, and also not squandering my time. I became very conscious of the fact that I only have a certain amount of time in a given day to work on a book. That was part of the reason why I was kind of going back and forth about doing this video series, because I'm like, well, that's going to be another X number of minutes a day I don't have to write. This whole thing is an experiment. We're going to see where it goes. So, that gives me incentives to keep things relatively focused. So just enough is more. And especially when you're exploring, a different world, the temptation exists to go wild and just explore every single detail of it, and to do it at such exhausting length that people can just stay there forever. And I'm realizing for me that doesn't work. It only has so much payoff after a certain point. After a certain point, it starts to become redundant. So you have to find the just enough point for that sort of thing. And that's what I gleaned out of bullet point 5 in this lecture. Less is not necessarily more. That, just enough is more. There are other bullet points that I'm going to be talking about from this lecture. Look for them uploading in the future. And until then, I will see you around.